Welcome to Gordan, Dark Tales. Tonight, we invite you to uncover a story that will creep under your skin and linger long after the lights go out. Beneath the Bed isn't just a bedtime tale. It's a journey into fear, a descent into the unknown, where every shadow holds a secret and every sound sparks doubt. This is a story about Abigail, a 12-year-old girl who thought she was spending a peaceful week with her grandmother in the quiet countryside. But what she found in that house was far from peaceful. Imagine arriving at an old home, where every creak of the floorboards whispers of the past, where the night isn't just silent, it's heavy, pressing against your chest, daring you to breathe. In this tale, you'll witness strange behaviors, a grandmother who seems so sweet by day, but turns unsettling by night. Footsteps in the dark, whispers behind closed doors, and inexplicable events that grow more chilling with each passing hour. And then there's the bed, the safe haven for a child, or so Abigail thought. What she experienced beneath that bed will test the limits of what she can endure, and perhaps what you can endure as well. If you stay with us until the end, you'll face a final revelation so haunting it will leave you questioning what is real and what lies hidden in the shadows. So, listener, this is your choice. Step away now while you still can, or join us on this terrifying journey. But be warned, what you're about to hear may not let you sleep. Put on your headphones, close your eyes, and remember, beneath the bed, the darkness hides more than just dust. This is Abigail's story.
Hello, my name is Abigail, but everyone calls me Abby. I'm 25 years old now, but the story I'm about to tell you happened when I was just 12. It was supposed to be a simple visit to my grandmother's house, a way to keep her company after my grandfather passed away. She was 85 at the time and had refused to leave the home they had shared for decades. My mom thought it would be good for me to spend a few days with her. I was on my school break, and to be honest, I didn't mind the idea. I liked the countryside, or at least I thought I did. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience. The trip itself was long and boring, hours of staring out the car window as the city disappeared and the roads narrowed, twisting and turning into what felt like the middle of nowhere. I remember the moment we turned onto the last dirt road, and my mom said, "Almost there." The trees on either side seemed to close in, forming a tunnel that made the sunlight struggle to get through. When we finally arrived, my first thought was that the house looked like something out of an old storybook. Big, wooden, and surrounded by silence. It sat in the middle of an overgrown yard with ivy climbing the walls and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The shutters hung crooked and the paint was peeling, but there was something almost magical about it. Or maybe it was just the kind of magic that hides something darker underneath. My grandma was waiting on the porch. She waved at us, and for a moment she looked like the grandma I remembered, warm and kind. But as I got closer, I noticed how much she had changed. She seemed smaller somehow, like the weight of the past year had shrunk her. Her smile was there, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Abby, my sweet girl," she said as she hugged me tightly. Her embrace was strong, but there was a sadness to it, as if she was holding on to something more than just me. Inside, the house smelled of tea, old wood, and something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was strange. Like the house itself was alive and had its own scent. The furniture was old, the kind you'd expect in a home that had been around for decades. Heavy curtains blocked most of the daylight, and the only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock and the creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. "This will be your room," my grandma said, leading me down a long, narrow hallway. The door opened to a small room with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt. It looked cozy, but the bed frame sat higher off the ground than I was used to, leaving a dark space underneath that made me uneasy. "Thank you, Grandma," I said, trying to sound cheerful, even though the shadows in the room seemed to stretch further than they should. That first evening was quiet. My mom stayed for dinner, but I noticed how quickly she was ready to leave. She hugged me tightly and said, "Be good, Abby. Your grandma needs you." Then she got in the car and drove off, leaving me standing on the porch, watching the taillights disappear into the night. I went to bed early, feeling the kind of tired you only get from long car rides. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this house wasn't quite right. The air was too still, and the silence felt too heavy, like the house was holding its breath. That first night, I remember lying in bed and trying to fall asleep, but the house had other plans. It wasn't the usual creaks of an old home settling into the ground. It was something different. Every sound seemed deliberate. The bed was big, too big for me. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender, but underneath there was something musty and old, like the scent of a forgotten closet. I pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to feel safe, but my eyes kept drifting to the space under the bed. It was dark, darker than it should have been. I couldn't see the floor, just an inky black void that seemed to stretch deeper than the frame allowed. I closed my eyes tightly and told myself it was nothing. "It's just a shadow," I whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it true. I must have drifted off eventually because the next thing I remember is waking up to a faint noise. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but then it became clearer. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the wooden floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and for a moment the silence was deafening. I stared at the door, expecting it to creak open, but it didn't. Instead, I heard a soft shuffle, like someone dragging their feet away. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the heavy curtains, and for a brief moment, I thought I had imagined everything. But when I got out of bed, I saw it. Muddy footprints on the floor leading from the door to the side of my bed. "Grandma?" I asked during breakfast, my voice trembling. "Did you come into my room last night?" She looked at me with a kind but puzzled expression. "No, dear. I went to bed early. Why do you ask?" I didn't know what to say. Should I tell her about the footprints, the footsteps, the shadow under the bed? I decided against it. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. The day passed quietly. Grandma spent most of her time in the kitchen or sitting in her rocking chair by the window, knitting something I couldn't quite make out. I tried to keep busy, exploring the yard and the woods behind the house, but there was an uneasiness I couldn't shake. As night fell, the house seemed to change again. The walls felt closer, the shadows darker. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door, waiting for something I couldn't explain. I told myself that tonight would be different, that I wouldn't let my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew the house had other plans. That night felt heavier than the first, the kind of weight you don't notice until you're lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling and realizing how thick the silence has become. I was tired, though too tired to dwell on it for long. Slowly, sleep crept in, wrapping me in its deceptive comfort. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when it started. A sound. Quiet at first, like the faint creak of old wood. Then heavier. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. and climbing the stairs. My heart began to race, but I stayed still, my body frozen in that half-conscious state between waking and dreaming. It's just Grandma, I told myself. She probably forgot something in my room. But the sound didn't match her usual shuffle. These steps were heavier, and they echoed in the silence like they didn't belong. The footsteps grew closer, each one drawing out the tension in the air, until they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath. My eyes stayed shut, every nerve in my body screaming to stay still. The door creaked open slowly, its hinges whining as though reluctant to let anyone through. I could feel someone or something standing there just inside the doorway. I told myself not to open my eyes, not to move. If it was Grandma, she'd see I was asleep and leave. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The floorboards groaned as the footsteps resumed, this time inside my room. They were slow, almost deliberate, as if the person or thing was taking their time. I could feel the weight of each step vibrating through the wooden floor beneath my bed. And then they stopped, right next to me. My breath was shallow, barely a whisper. I kept my eyes tightly shut, pretending to be lost in a child's dream. I could hear the faint rustle of clothing, and for a moment I thought it was over, that whoever it was would just leave. But then I felt it. The bed frame shifted slightly, creaking under the strain of something or someone crawling beneath it. The sound was slow, deliberate, and horrifyingly real. The mattress above me trembled faintly, as if something heavy was settling directly underneath. The wooden slats beneath the mattress groaned softly, as if being pushed upward by some unseen force. I bit down on my lip, desperate not to make a sound, as every nerve in my body screamed for me to run. But I couldn't. I stayed there, frozen, clinging to the hope that whatever was under my bed would just stay there. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My whole body was locked in place, as if the weight of the moment had pinned me to the bed. The mattress creaked again, this time softer, almost as if something below me had shifted its position. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. Grandma, I thought. Why would she crawl under my bed? The question swirled in my mind, but the answer didn't come. Instead, a chilling realization settled over me. That doesn't sound like her. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with a strange, suffocating tension. I reached for the only comfort I had, the blanket. Slowly, cautiously, I pulled it over my head, careful not to let the fabric rustle too loudly. Beneath the safety of the covers, I felt like a prisoner in my own bed. And then I heard it. It wasn't footsteps or creaks this time. It was breathing. Low, guttural, and unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The sound was uneven, like the shallow growl of an animal waiting to strike. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the blanket tighter. Stay quiet, Abby, I told myself. Just stay quiet. My heart pounded so hard that I was sure it could be heard beneath the bed. The breathing grew louder, more deliberate, as if whatever was down there was waiting for me to make a mistake. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. I couldn't tell. Time seemed to stretch in this suffocating silence, each second feeling heavier than the last. My mind raced, trying to piece together what could be happening. What if it isn't Grandma? What if it's something else? And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sounds stopped. No breathing, no shifting, nothing. Just silence. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. I didn't dare peek out from under the blanket. It felt like the only barrier between me and whatever nightmare had crept into my room. Eventually, exhaustion won. The terror that had kept me frozen began to fade, replaced by the overwhelming weight of sleep. My body relaxed, my grip on the blanket loosening, and without realizing it, I drifted off. The morning sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long streaks of light across the wooden floor. I woke to the faint sound of something jingling, a soft rhythmic chime. As my eyes adjusted to the dim room, I saw her. Grandma stood in the doorway, a small silver bell in her hand. Her face lit up with a warm smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice cheerful and light. "Breakfast is ready. Come on down." I sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. The room felt different in the daylight, less menacing, but still holding on to that faint, unshakable unease. I tried to convince myself that the night before was just a bad dream. And downstairs, the smell of food greeted me, warm, comforting, and familiar. Grandma had set the table with toast, eggs, and a steaming mug of hot chocolate. It looked perfect, like something out of a storybook. She hummed softly as she poured herself a cup of tea, her movements graceful and calm. "Sit, Abby," she said, motioning to the chair across from her. "I made your favorite." I sat hesitantly, watching her carefully. She seemed different. The grandma I remembered, kind, loving, and full of warmth. She reached across the table and placed a hand on mine, her eyes soft and full of affection. Ah, it's so nice having you here, she said. This house has been so lonely since your grandfather passed. You've brought life back into it. I forced a smile, but my stomach churned. Her kindness felt genuine, but it was hard to reconcile this version of her with the one I'd heard wandering the house last night. Thanks, Grandma, I said quietly, poking at my eggs with a fork. For a moment, I thought about telling her about the footsteps, the creaking, and the thing that had crawled under my bed. But the words wouldn't come. What if she didn't believe me? Or worse, what if she did? Instead, I focused on eating, letting the warmth of the hot chocolate calm my nerves. But the unease never left. Is everything all right, Abby? Grandma asked, tilting her head. You've barely touched your food. I hesitated, then blurted out, when's Mom coming to pick me up? Her expression faltered just for a second before she smiled again. Why do you ask, sweetheart? Don't you like it here with me? And, I do, I lied. The words tumbling out too quickly. It's just that I promised my friend we'd go to Disney together. I forgot to tell Mom. Grandma raised an eyebrow, her smile turning slightly curious. Disney? That's quite the trip. Funny, your mother didn't mention it to me. Her words hung in the air, heavy and questioning. I stared down at my plate, avoiding her gaze. The truth was, I wanted to leave. I wanted to be anywhere but here. The day dragged on, each hour feeling heavier than the last. I stayed in the living room, flipping through channels on the old television, hoping to find something to distract me, but the static hum of the TV only amplified the silence that loomed in the house. I avoided looking out the windows, the overgrown yard, the shadowy trees. It all felt too still, like the entire world was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the memory of last night. The footsteps, the creaking, the thing under my bed. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Grandmama came into the room, her hands on her hips. Abby, enough TV, she said firmly. Dinner's ready, and after that, it's bedtime. But it's only 6, I protested, trying to keep the edge of fear out of my voice. Early to bed, early to rise, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Now, come eat. I didn't argue. I ate quickly, barely tasting the food, and then shuffled upstairs to my room. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the house itself was aware of my growing fear. I crawled into bed, pulling the quilt up to my chin. and stared at the ceiling. I told myself I wouldn't sleep, that I'd stay awake and listen. But the weight of the day was too much. And before I knew it, I was drifting off. A loud clap of thunder shook the house, pulling me from my uneasy sleep. The room was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the walls, casting eerie, fleeting shadows. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. And then I heard it. A voice. No, not a voice. A sound, a song. Faint at first, rising and falling in a strange, uneven melody. It wasn't in English. The words were garbled, unfamiliar, and unsettling. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from outside. I crept to the window, each step feeling heavier than the last, and pulled back the curtain just enough to see. My breath caught in my throat. There she was, Grandma, standing in the middle of the yard, drenched from head to toe. Her thin nightgown clung to her small frame, and a black sack, like a garbage bag, was draped over her head. She was barefoot, her feet sinking into the muddy ground as she moved in slow, jerky motions, if she was singing. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone was haunting, like a broken lullaby sung off-key. Her hands flailed wildly as she ran back and forth, splashing through puddles and smearing mud up her legs. My chest tightened, panic clawing at my throat. What is she doing? The thought echoed in my head as I watched her stumble and sway. I let the curtain fall and backed away from the window, trembling. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. She's lost it. She's gone, completely mad. Without thinking, I dove back into bed, pulling the quilt over my head. The sound of the rain, the wind, and her singing filled my ears, but I clamped my hands over them, blocking it out as best I could. Please, God, please, let this night end. I stayed that way, huddled under the blanket, praying for sleep to take me. The first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, weak and cold, barely warming the wooden floor. I sat up in bed, my body aching from a restless night. That's when I saw them. Footprints, dark, muddy prints, trailed across the floor, starting from the door and ending right under my bed. I froze. My chest tightened and every instinct screamed at me to stay still, not to look under the bed. Whatever had made those footprints, it wasn't me, and it wasn't Grandma. I swung my legs off the bed carefully, my toes barely brushing the floor. My breath came in shallow gasps as I edged toward the door, my eyes avoiding the shadows beneath the bed frame. I didn't want to see. I couldn't see. Downstairs, the smell of toast and coffee greeted me, familiar and warm, as if nothing was wrong. Grandma was in her chair by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly in a steady rhythm. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said without looking up. Her voice was soft, sweet, completely normal. I didn't respond right away. My voice felt trapped in my throat, tangled up with the images of those muddy prints. Finally, I managed to ask, "Grandma, can I call my mom?" She paused, her needle stopping mid-stitch. "Of course, my love. The phone's in the kitchen. It's old, but it works." Her smile was kind, reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she let on. Yes. I hurried to the kitchen, my hands trembling. As I lifted the heavy rotary phone, the numbers clicked loudly as I dialed, each sound echoing in the quiet house. Mom answered on the second ring. "Hello?" I swallowed hard, lowering my voice to a whisper. "Mom, something's wrong. I don't know what it is, but I don't want to stay here anymore. Please come get me." Her tone shifted instantly. "Abby, what's going on? Are you okay?" "I don't know. It's just weird here. I'm scared." "Alright," she said after a pause. "I'll come first thing tomorrow morning. Just hold on, okay? You'll be fine. I promise." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Thanks, Mom." I hung up the phone and turned around, only to find Grandma standing in the doorway. Her expression was calm, her eyes soft. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. She didn't say anything, just turned and walked out to the garden. I followed her to the window, curiosity getting the better of me. She was crouched near the rabbit hutch, gently stroking one of the rabbits. For a moment, she looked happy, like the sadness that had clung to her since Grandpa's passing had lifted. I watched as she picked up one of the rabbits, cradling it like a baby. Her face softened into a rare, genuine smile, and I almost felt relieved. Almost. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. As the sun began to set, the air in the house grew heavier. The warmth of the morning felt like a distant memory, replaced by a creeping chill that settled in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen. I spent the day glued to the couch, pretending to watch TV but barely registering the flickering images. I didn't want to go outside. The yard, the trees, everything felt wrong. Like the house and everything around it was alive, watching me. By 6 o'clock, Grandma came in and switched off the TV. "Time for dinner, Abby," she said cheerfully. I looked at the clock, trying to suppress a groan. It was barely 6, and she was already talking about bedtime. "Not tired," I mumbled. "Nonsense," she said, smiling as she set a plate in front of me. "Early to bed, early to rise. That's the rule in this house." I ate in silence, forcing down every bite. My stomach churned with nerves, and all I could think about was the promise my mom had made she'd be here tomorrow. I just had to make it through one more night. When dinner was done, I climbed the stairs to my room, each step heavier than the last. The hallway felt darker tonight, the shadows stretching longer than usual. My room greeted me with its usual stillness, but even that felt oppressive now. Crawled into bed, pulling the quilt up to my chin, and stared at the ceiling. Ugh, sleep didn't come. I just lay there, counting the minutes, praying for the hours to pass quickly, but then the sounds started again. It began as a faint creak, the floorboards groaning under a shifting weight. My heart raced as I gripped the edge of the quilt, every muscle in my body tense. And then I heard its movement. Under the bed. The noise wasn't subtle this time. Whatever was down there was large, shifting and scraping against the wooden floor. The frame of the bed trembled slightly, and I swore I felt the mattress lift for just a second. I held my breath, clutching the blanket tighter. The sound grew louder, a deep, guttural noise that wasn't quite human. It was like the grinding of teeth or the rasp of something sharp dragging across wood. My mind raced. What is it? What does it want? I squeezed my eyes shut, retreating deeper into the quilt. The noise continued, the bed frame creaking and groaning as if the thing beneath it was turning over or shifting its weight. I didn't dare move. My heart pounded so loudly that I thought it might give me away. I prayed silently, begging for the night to end, for the first rays of sunlight to break through the curtains. But the night stretched on, every minute dragging like an eternity. I don't know when it stopped. One moment, the bed frame was trembling, the sound of something shifting beneath me almost unbearable, and then silence. I didn't move. I didn't even dare to breathe. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that it drowned out everything else. The minutes passed, maybe hours, before I finally let myself peek out from under the blanket. The room was dark, shadows stretching across the walls with every flicker of moonlight, but it felt still. I stayed like that, frozen, until I heard it, a soft thud, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. Whatever had been under the bed was now walking away. The sound grew fainter, moving down the hall and out of the room. I pressed my ear against the mattress, listening as it disappeared into the depths of the house. I whispered a silent prayer, clutching the blanket like a lifeline. Please don't come back. Please don't come back. But then I heard something else. It started softly, a faint rustling sound from outside. Then came the sharp, panicked cries. It was the rabbits. Their hutch was right below my window, and they were frantic, thumping, scratching, their terrified squeals echoing in the quiet night. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just lie there. Slowly, I got out of bed, my legs shaking as I walked to the window. The floor felt cold beneath my feet, each step heavier than the last. I pulled back the curtain just a crack and looked outside. Grandma was there. She was crouched in the garden, her thin figure illuminated by the pale moonlight. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, muddy. She was holding something small and squirming in her hands. For a moment, I thought she was comforting one of the rabbits, but then she stood. Her nightgown was soaked, clinging to her frail body, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the dark stains streaking the fabric, the way her hands glistened in the moonlight. And then she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but her mouth was smeared with something dark and red. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat as the realization hit me. Blood. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The image of her bloodied face burned into my mind, and I couldn't shake the horror of what I'd just seen. I collapsed onto the bed, pulling the blanket over my head and squeezing my eyes shut. I prayed that morning would come, that this nightmare would end. I'm not leaving this bed, I whispered to myself over and over. I'm not leaving until Mom gets here. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I lay awake all night, curled under the blanket, my body stiff from hours of fear. Every sound, the creak of the house, the rustle of the wind, made me flinch. I didn't dare move, didn't dare look. I just prayed for the sun to rise. When I finally heard the crunch of tires on gravel, my heart leapt. Mom. She was here. I threw off the blanket and bolted downstairs, my feet barely touching the steps. The front door creaked open, and there she was, standing in the doorway with a look of concern on her face. Mom, I cried, running into her arms. She hugged me tightly, smoothing my hair. "Abby, what's wrong? Are you okay?" I didn't answer, just held on to her like my life depended on it. Her warmth, her presence was the first time I'd felt safe in days. Graham appeared behind us, her expression unreadable. She smiled faintly, but her eyes seemed distant. "Thank you for coming, dear," she said to Mom. "It was so nice having Abby here. She's such a sweet girl." And Mom nodded, glancing down at me. "Abby, why don't you get your things while I talk to Grandma?" I hesitated, not wanting to leave her side. But the thought of staying in this house even a second longer pushed me forward. I grabbed my bag from the bedroom, careful not to look at the floor or the bed, and hurried back downstairs. The two of them were still talking as I climbed into the backseat of the car. The moment I sat down, a wave of exhaustion hit me, and my eyes grew heavy. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, the car was moving. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, the familiar hum of the engine comforting. Then I looked back. Grandma was standing on the porch, waving goodbye, her frail frame silhouetted against the morning light. I waved back, a small part of me feeling guilty for wanting so desperately to leave. But then I saw it. In the window of the room where I had stayed, there was another figure. It was a woman, older than Grandma, with skin so pale it looked almost translucent. Her eyes were dark, empty pits, and her dress was tattered and gray. She stood, motionless, staring down at me. My chest tightened and I whipped my head back around, facing forward in the seat. I didn't say a word. I didn't look back again.
Abigail left that house, but a shadow of doubt followed her for years. 2 days after her visit, her grandmother passed away. No one ever uncovered the truth about what happened in that place, and the questions lingered, unanswered. What Abigail didn't share in her account is how deeply that experience scarred her. Throughout her teenage years, the memories haunted her, driving her to therapists and countless treatments that seemed to lead nowhere. Even as the years went by, she couldn't escape it. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she swore she could hear something moving under her bed, long after she had left her grandmother's house behind. But there's hope in every story, even the darkest ones. Abigail's turning point came when a close friend invited her to a Christian church. It was there that she found the peace she had been searching for, the strength to let go of the nightmares. Now she's married, has a family of her own, and lives free from the fear that once controlled her. Only after conquering her demons could she finally share what she had kept hidden for so many years. But what do you think truly happened that week? Was it real, or just the vivid imagination of a scared little girl? And what about the other woman in the window, the one who wasn't her grandmother? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy unraveling tales like this one and want to dive into more mysteries, be sure to subscribe to our channel. A new, even more terrifying story is on the way. But be warned, If fear grips your heart, it's better to stay away. Remember, fear is inevitable, but courage is always a choice.